Hey everyone, Ben here with Greb's Garage. Today I was going to show you how to replace the dash in this 2010 Mazda 3 that's unfortunately suffering from the melting dash phenomenon that Mazdas are subject to. But unfortunately the one I pulled from the junkyard is showing some early signs of melting as well, so I'm not going to go through the trouble of pulling that and putting it in. However, it's a nice day and I wanted to come out and do something car related, so today I'm going to teach you how to leather wrap your emergency brake handle. And this is actually applicable to any car. So we'll begin by taking some measurements and then I'll show you step by step how we can achieve this. Cool, now we're in the car and the first step is we need to determine how long our piece of leather is going to be to wrap, and then also the width, which is essentially the circumference of our e-brake handle. In this Mazda, the e-brake handle is round, so we're going to have the same width across the board and it's going to be a uniform length. So if we measure, just say from this line down to here, we're looking at about 3 11/16. So I'll just make a note of that. So 3 11/16. And we can go ahead and measure the circumference. And for the circumference, we want this to actually be a little shorter than the actual width. That way, when we're doing the stitching, everything will pull tight. Here it looks like 3 3/4 would be just a little bit short, and then when we do the actual stitching, when we come back in the car, we'll be able to close that gap. So we'll go 3 3/4 for the width. Okay, cool. Now that we've got our measurements, which were 3 11/16 for the length and 3 3/4 of an inch for the width, I like to go ahead and just draw this out on a piece of cardboard so I can cut this out and then pattern on the leather. I think it just makes things a lot easier. So we'll just go ahead and use my little square and we'll find 3 and there's 8, 9, 10, about 11/16 right there. So we can just draw a straight line. And then come down this side for 3 3/4. Just make sure I didn't overshoot here. And we'll just complete our little rectangle. So on the side we're about 3 3/4. And then just think we're good here. Then we can go ahead and just cut this piece out. And the nice thing about this is, even if you're off a little bit, with the stitching, you can kind of pull things back together, so it shouldn't be a problem. Because honestly, this is pretty much a square at this point. Cool. Okay, so what we'll end up doing is we're going to trace this out on a piece of leather, and then we're going to cut this out, and then along the length width, which honestly I think the way this got cut, this is essentially a square, so I honestly don't know that the length and width really matter too much at this point because we're only off by 1/16. So that's basically 1/4 and basically 3/4. So we essentially have a square here, which is fine. Yeah, once this got cut out, this essentially became a square. Again, when it comes to leather, a 16th really isn't that much of a difference. But big picture, what we'll end up having once we cut this out on a piece of leather is we're going to have some evenly spaced holes along the length direction. And these holes are going to be what we stitch through. And we're going to do a baseball stitch, which is a really popular stitch for joining two edges of leather together. So let's go ahead and we're going to mark where we want our holes, and then we'll go ahead and cut this out of leather. Okay, before I trace out where I want this to be on leather, I'm going to measure in about 1/4 of an inch on each side, and this is going to be on the length side. And what this is going to be is this is essentially going to be the line that I draw my stitches along. So line up, and I'll just make a mark about 1/4 of an inch. And then I just come down here, also do 1/4 of an inch. So we got a line, just go ahead and make this a straight line. Oops, a little stronger than I wanted there, but that's okay. So we can just make sure we're at about 1/4 of an inch, 1/4 of an inch. And then we're also going to do this on the opposite side because we will need to make our stitch holes on both sides. So about 1/4 of an inch, 1/4 of an inch. Just make sure this lines up, straight line. And we can just double check, that's 1/4, it's 1/4. Okay, and now I'm gonna go ahead and measure out where the holes are gonna be. And what I'm wanting to do is, I want the first stitch hole to be about 1/4 of an inch from this end. So we're going to be 1/4, and then I'm going to do one every 3/8 of an inch after. So 1, 2, 3. That's a little close on that end, but it'll be okay. And we're just going to repeat the same on this end, but we want to make sure we're starting at the same ends here because we need these holes to perfectly align with those. So we come in about 1/4, and then 1, 2, 3. So now we have the spacing of our holes, and the baseball stitch is a very decorative stitch, and by having this spacing, it'll allow us to have a nice stitch that we can actually see when we have this on our e-brake handle. Okay, before I throw this on the leather to trace it out and cut, I'm going to flip it over and use some double-sided sewing tape. And so you just put this stuff on. This stuff is great. It doesn't leave a residue. And the reason I'm doing this is when this is on the leather for me to trace around, I want it to stay stationary because I'm going to come through with my leather awl and I'm going to pre-mark each of these holes for stitching so that I know where I need to actually punch the holes. And then I'm going to come through with this little leather punch and just choose the right hole width, and it just comes through and it will punch a nice hole for stitching. So I'm going to grab my leather hide, and then we're going to go ahead and cut this out. So I have a piece of leather for my hide that I've been working with for other projects, and I think this will make a nice piece for this emergency brake handle. One thing to note with leather is depending on where you're getting this from the hide, it's going to be stretchier in one direction than the other. So if I pull in this direction, there's a little bit of stretch, but if I pull in this direction, there's a lot of stretch. So I want my stitch holes to be aligned in the direction with more stretch today, because when I'm stitching this together, remember we made this a little bit shorter than the actual circumference of the e-brake handle, it'll pull that leather together and just make a really nice actual stitch. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to peel off the back of the double-sided tape that we used on our pattern, and just leaving behind the tape. Sometimes getting the little tape backing off can be a little bit of a pain, but today it seems to be behaving, if I don't jinx myself. Just double checking again that the stretch is in this direction. It's in that direction, so we want our stitch holes to line up that way. Make sure the leather's nice and flat. And we can see the grain here. And I'm just gonna place the pattern here. It is nice and secure. And I'm going to use a Fisher Silver ink pen, which works really well for marking on this leather. The mark shows up, and then any leather cleaner removes this really easily. So this one is really nice for just going around, and we can just go around our pattern here. Go around. I want to make sure this shows up well, because once I remove it, you'll never get it aligned perfectly again. So you want to make sure that everything is marked well the first time. And before I pull this off, I'm going to take my leather awl, and for each of the stitch holes, I'm just going to push straight down, and this will leave a small little hole in the leather where it should be super easy to find where we need to line up our stitches. And I am putting down a fair amount of force with each of these holes, because as I mentioned with the silver ink pen, if you have to come back in, it can be difficult, if not downright impossible, to get things perfectly aligned again. And we really want to make sure that we do keep things aligned. This sort of falls in that measure twice, cut once philosophy. So we just come through, marking each of our holes. Boom. Boom. And one last. Sweet. And just from a quick glance, these look nicely aligned, so I don't foresee there being any issues. And may not be the easiest to see, but there are nice little holes right here that actually are pretty easy to pick up, and we'll be able to easily make those a little bit larger for stitching. So now that this has been traced out and the holes have been punched, using an extremely sharp pair of scissors, we need to go ahead and cut this out. Now, the one thing to keep in mind is our pattern perfectly fit what we were looking for, and then we came around with this pen. We want to cut on the inside of this line, because otherwise we're adding a little bit of width to it. And for an application like this, it may not be the most important thing in the world, but we want to make sure that our cutout piece matches our measurements to the greatest extent possible. And I like to just take my time, because unfortunately, if you mess up, you have to start all over, and we definitely don't want to waste leather. And there's one side, and then we just come around and just keep going. And it's totally okay to take your time. Just keep going, and just a little bit past the corner. We'll pivot, we'll come down this corner. And what I like to do when I'm coming through something like this, where this ends on the edge, I'm just gonna cut all the way out, and then I'll just have a free piece to cut through that last side. We're just going to keep cutting on this inside line. Keep cutting. Keep cutting. And when you're cutting, you want to be careful not to stretch the leather as you're cutting. You just want to hold it, let it fall naturally, and now we have just this free piece to work with. These remnants, the scrap piece of leather here, they're super useful for small projects like this, and so I like to keep those around as well. So now I'm just going to cut this last little piece off, which will leave us with our piece. Cool. Now this little scrap I can just toss, or sometimes I will use it for setting tension on my sewing machine, but we really don't need it anymore here. So now that this is cut, I'm going to use this leather punch. I believe I got this from Tandy Leather years ago. And what I'll do is I'll find the little hole, line the point up in the hole, and punch through. And that just makes let's see if I can get this in focus for you here. It just makes a cleaner hole that goes all the way through that's a little bit easier when you're coming through to do stitching. And so what I'll do is I'm just going to go through each of the holes that we marked with the awl when we were working with the pattern, and I'm just going to punch those out so that when we're stitching it is a lot easier to come through. And I sort of use the same approach when I'm leather wrapping steering wheels. The only difference is it's a lot more leather to work with to wrap a steering wheel than a little 3-inch long e-brake handle. And now I'll come through the other side, and this is why you really need to put a lot of pressure down, is to make sure that you can find your holes, because especially with black leather, it is really easy to lose track of these little guys. So we come through, boom, boom, boom. And the nice thing is, because the leather all kind of went through them, this point on this leather punch tends to center itself as you're coming through. And, all right. So that should do it, and just for a sanity check, we can make sure that we have the same number of holes on each side. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Awesome. So now our holes are set. And what I'm going to do as well, and this step is completely optional, is I'm going to use some of this double-sided tape again. I'm just going to run a strip down the center. And what this will do is, when we're in the car and actually wrapping this on the e-brake, because I've got this tape, it'll sort of hold it in place so that I don't have to try to hold it in place and stitch at the same time. So now I'm going to go ahead and start prepping my thread and needles. Okay, now that the leather's cut, I'm going to go ahead and thread my needles. The needles I'm using are harness needles, and they're essentially blunt tip needles designed for hand stitching leather. If we look through the holes we punched earlier, they're going to thread through very smoothly. The thread I'm using is a waxed cord. Looks like it's from Maine Thread Company. I believe I might have gotten this from the Thread Exchange, and I'll leave links in the description below to where I got some of these supplies. So the wax thread makes it easy to feed through the leather. So to go ahead and get started, we need to thread one end through a needle. So we'll go ahead and see if we can get this thread through the eyelet of the needle. We get it through, and we pull through enough of a tail that the tip of the needle can come back through the tail. And what this will do is we sort of poke the needle through the center of the thread of the tail. And let's see if I can get this to focus a little bit. There we go. So the tip of the needle went through the tail of the thread, and then we're going to pull the needle all the way through, and it's going to create a little knot, and then as we pull down, it secures the end of the needle to the thread. And I'm going to go ahead and just pull out more thread than I need, so maybe 3 times the length of our leather piece, which is honestly probably overkill. I'm just going to cut, and we'll repeat the same for the second needle. And we'll be using a 2-needle stitching technique to attach this to our emergency brake handle. So just like the first, we thread through, then we bring the needle, and in the tail of the thread, we're just going to kind of stab the needle. Well, stab sounds harsh. Let's poke the needle through the thread, and that wasn't really through the center, so I kind of want to come back through the center. We pull, and it's going to give us a nice little knot. So at this point, we have a piece of wax thread set up with 2 needles on the end. So all we have to do now is take our little leather wrap to the emergency brake handle and start stitching. All right, now we're back out in the car, and we're gonna wrap our piece that we've prepared around the e-brake handle. So the first thing I'm gonna do is just pull off the backing of that little bit of tape we put on earlier, so that we can just kind of hold this in place and not worry about it. So we'll just kind of center that so that the top comes up. So that ends around that line, about there. So that looks pretty good. It's kind of centered, that'll hold nicely. So now we're gonna take our 2 needles, and we're gonna come through one side. So we come through the top of the leather, out the back side, and then on the other side we come through the back side and out through the front side. And once this goes through, we wanna make sure that we've pulled the thread about even, so we want even length on each side. But then we're going to come back through with 1 needle. So in this case, I'm going to take the thread coming out of the right, I'm going to loop back around, and I'm going to come back through the hole on the left, and just pull that needle through and make sure I'm not stabbing the thread. And then I'm going to come back again, and this double loop here is going to secure the end of the thread. So we're just going to pull, and we're going to make sure that we've got about even lengths of thread on both sides. Oh goodness, there we go. And once it starts moving, it'll be easy to get both lengths of thread. And I need to come a little bit more this way. Cool. And we can see that by pulling these threads tight, it's drawn the 2 pieces of leather together. And by starting at the bottom, our baseball stitches are going to be angling up. So we've pulled these 2 pieces tight. We've got our 2 threads. I'm right-handed, so I'm going to start from the right to the left. So I'm going to take my needle on the right. I'm going to come from the underside of the leather, and I'm going to just come through the hole. So I'm going to pull my needle through, and that thread comes up. Then I'm going to take the needle that was on the left, and I'm going to come through the hole on the right piece of leather. And we pull it through, the threads overlap, and I give it a nice tug. And we're just going to repeat this process going right, then left. Yeah, have to find a little hole over here. And then you pull snug, and then you repeat. Right, then left. And pull snug. And you can see each time you pull, it's pulling that leather tight, and you can see the baseball stitch forming. Of course, this stitch gets its name because it is very common on baseballs. So we go right, then we go left, and we pull snug,
And as you start moving up, you're going to need to hold tension. Just keep holding those threads so that you don't lose that tension you've done. Sometimes your needles fall off. All right, and now that the needles are back on, we're just going to keep going from our right to left and left to right. So come through, needle finds the hole, bam, bam, pull snug. And now that we're moving up, you kind of need to pinch and hold that tension as you're coming through. We only have a few more holes to go, which is good. Boom, boom. And just keep pulling even tension each time you come up, and just continue that hole right to left and left to right. Sometimes if a hole feels like it may not be all the way through, you can just kind of widen it out with your needle a little bit. There we go. Secure. And then come through this one and pull snug. And then we only have one left after this. Just gonna make sure that hole's ready. And goodness gracious, where are you? And there you are. So we see. There we go. All right, and then I'm gonna kind of hold tight here now that we're approaching the very last one. So the last one, we're gonna do something a little bit different. So we do the right to left, but once we have come through, we have finished that, and we make sure that everything's snug and our stitches look good, everything looks nice and even. In my case, because I'm right-handed, I'm gonna take my right, I'm gonna come over to kind of form a loop, come through, and then I'm going to come through this side again, pull a needle, and kind of add this straight stitch right at the top. And then I'm going to take the left, I'm going to come through from this side, and a little tricky, but kind of prod around a bit. Sometimes you have to pull through like this, come through, get it through, and now we've got both threads through, and we can create this nice loop at the top. And from here, we can just snip these threads, and boom, and boom. And at that point, we are done. So this emergency brake handle has now been wrapped in a piece of leather. Has a nice feel to it. It is leather, boom. And that is all there is to wrapping an emergency brake handle in leather.